All right. So I'm gonna show you 5 images, and then we're gonna have a little bit of a conversation about these images. All right. So let's pop the first one up, Marianne. Who knows what that is? An aeroplane. It's a jet. It's not an aeroplane. It's a jet, people. All right. So that's a jet. All right. Let's move on to the second one. Taj Mahal. Yeah. Well done, Greg. All right. Next one. Blender. Yeah. All right. Next one. That's a super yacht. Exactly. That's a super yacht. And then one more. This is a solid gold bath tub. All right. Filled with M&Ms. No, it's not filled with M&Ms. All right. So if we go to the next slide. All right. I want you to talk to the person next to you, and I want you to work out what is the link between all of these, because they are connected. All right, so have a chat to 1 or 2 people around you and work out what is the common theme there. Well, it's not, yeah, what links them? All right, how we going, people? Coming up with some creative ideas. All right, okay. Let's see if you come up with the same thing I did, because this is the test, right? Whether your mind works like mine, so there's not much chance of us landing on the same page here. All right, let's start over this side. Who from this side wants to take a punt and work out what links these all together? You think the blender? Yeah, rich people have blenders? Yeah, okay. So you've got to be rich. All right, that's one option. All right, I'll come back, Eddie, if we're still... All right, this group, this here, so... Petra, you said something that was interesting. They all hold something, right? That's a good observation. It's true. It's not the one I'm looking for, but it's a true statement. All right, we'll come over to this bank here. Owned by the same person. I don't know. I don't think so, actually. So, anyway, all right. This group over here, this bank. The pinnacle of man's innovation. The blender. Excellent. No, that's not the common link. So, Eddie, you had something in mind? Yep. But that's not the link. This one. I'm only going through once more. Oh, Sam. They all have value. Yes.
Design.
They all have design. Yes. These are all true statements, but it's not the thing that links them. All made in India? I don't know if that's true or not, Paul. And I'm really not sure about that statement. But anyway. Yes. Pointless unless used. Yes. Although I think the gold bathtub, even when it's used, is pointless. All right. Do you want all right. So the thing that links all of these together is that they were all gifts. Did anyone say that? See, Jim, you should listen to your wife more often, all right? Okay, they were all gifts. I gave Roz the blender, in case you're wondering, all right? So, not last week. It was actually, no, that's a story for a different time. All right, but all of these, scrap the blender, all of these were gifts that someone gave to someone else significant in their life. They're all pretty extravagant, aren't they? The Taj Mahal, that's a gift that took like 22 years. Imagine that if you said to your, significant other, I've got something for you. It's coming in 22 years. But it was like, no, it just took forever. And then the other gifts there, they're all significant and extravagant, aren't they? Extravagant things that people have given to one another. Today we're going to look at a scripture that talks about a super yacht. No, we're not. We're going to talk about a scripture where someone comes to Jesus and there's a very extravagant act towards him. And so it comes from the book of John, chapter 12. And this is kind of, over the next couple of weeks, we're sort of in our Easter preparation as we set our minds and our hearts towards the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Starting at verse 1 of chapter 12 of John. 6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honour. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said the perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor. Not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief, and since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." When all the people heard of Jesus' arrival, they flocked to see him and also to see Lazarus, the man Jesus has raised from the dead. Then the leading priests decided to kill Lazarus too, for it was because of him that many of the people had deserted them and believed in Jesus. So we have the setting here of what's happening at this moment. And if we pause for a moment and think about the book of John. So we're at chapter 12, and it's a week before the Passover, a week before the crucifixion. And what we notice in this book is that the first 11 chapters of John are about the rest of Jesus' life. And then from chapters 12 to 20 are about the week and the crucifixion. So John obviously has a lot of emphasis and thinks that there's a lot happening in this last week, that he dedicates basically half the book, half the letter, to this last week of Jesus' life. It's a significant portion that happens in the world of Jesus. And John takes his time. It's almost like the first 11 chapters, you're sort of moving through the life of Jesus, and then you get to the last 10 and everything slows down as John takes his time to unpack the moments that are happening as Jesus heads towards Jerusalem, as he's wrongly accused, as he's crucified, and then ultimately raised. So for John, this is a significant part of the life of Jesus that he wants to focus on. And the context of what we have here is this celebration meal that's taking place, because it's only in chapter 11 that we read of Lazarus' resurrection. That Jesus has come to Bethany and that he has, heard the heart cry of his friends who have lost their brother, and he comes and he raises Lazarus from the dead. And so we can assume that the text we have here of this meal that's taking place is in honour of this event. That Lazarus has been given back to his sisters, and that Jesus, the one who performed the miracle, is there. And they come together and they want to celebrate. Because Lazarus is back. And they want to celebrate that. And so there's this meal going on, and as we focused on a few weeks ago, Martha's busy serving and getting the stuff done. And then there's Mary who comes. And she comes and offers this extravagant, wild, amazing act of devotion towards Jesus. And so if we look at the text there, we see that that's kind of what's happening. They've gathered for a meal, and all this stuff's happening, and then Mary comes with the perfume. And traditionally, as we read through the scriptures, when you anointed someone, it was normally on the head. But she takes this position of absolute humility and she comes to Jesus' feet. And we need to remember that in Jesus' day, they didn't sit around chairs and tables like we do. They were down lower. They were often reclining, leaning in towards the food, their feet kind of focused out, laying around the food. And so she comes to his feet in that. But in absolute humility, comes to his feet. And she brings probably the most expensive thing that she owns. And she pours it on Jesus' feet. And the fragrance fills the house. And then she proceeds to undo her hair and starts soaking up the perfume off Jesus' feet with her hair. And then while this is happening, someone interrupts the moment and goes, "Shouldn't we have taken the money and given it to the poor?" Judas. You ever been in one of those moments where there's something significant happening and all of a sudden there's this weird comment that comes from left field? That's Judas' moment right there. He's like, and then Jesus defends her and says, "No, this is being done now in preparation for my burial." And there's a really interesting thing going on here because we probably don't associate, rich fragrances with death and burials. But in the Jewish culture in particular, in the days of Jesus, they didn't embalm the bodies and they would just go into the tomb. And so the idea of perfume was something that was used to mask the odour. If you read chapter 11 of the resurrection of Lazarus, Jesus comes along and everyone's wondering what's going to happen, and he says, "Roll the stone away." And then Martha's like, no, don't do that. Anyone remember why she said don't do that? Whew, he'll be a bit ripe. That's not okay. You see, they use perfume to mask the smell. Sometimes when we were living in Australia, you'd be driving along the freeway, you'd have the window down and you'd be cruising along and it'd be great. And then all of a sudden you'd just get that scent of roadkill. Because roadkill in Australia is not hedgehogs, rabbits and possums. Roadkill in Australia is kangaroos, wombats and all manner of things. And when you're driving down a highway in Australia in summer and there's a big roo on the side of the road which is just bellowed out because he's been sitting in the sun, and then you get that, what do you call it? The scent of disgust that fills your nostrils. And I suspect, living here in Taranaki, that some of you have stumbled across a decaying animal, much to your surprise. The smell isn't pleasant, is it? It's something that might even turn your stomach at the wrong moment. It's kind of, oh. And so the idea of perfume being used in the burial process was often around masking the smell of death, masking the smell of a decaying body. And even though they were in a tomb, there would still be that sense that some of it might sneak out. And so Jesus says in that moment, as she comes, he says to the room around him, she goes, "She's done this in preparation for my burial." And remember, this is a time of celebration. Lazarus has been brought back from the dead. And then Jesus says, "But she's done this in preparation for my burial." And I still suspect that probably everyone around that table had no idea that he was talking about within 7 days. Within 7 days, he would be dead. Because we read that throughout that last week of Jesus' life, the disciples were still unsure of what all of that meant. And even when Jesus is put in the tomb, they still didn't get that he was going to rise again in 3 days. They kind of missed the point. And so this is happening there in that moment. And we know that through the Easter story that Jesus' body doesn't in fact decay because he's raised back to life. But the symbolism of what was happening here in this moment cannot be lost. Preparation for what was to come. And so there are some significant things that are happening in this as Mary comes and she pours out this perfume on Jesus' feet. And we want to take a few moments to just sit with that imagery for a moment. Because I don't know about you, but I've read the Bible a lot over the years. And I've read a lot of accounts that, for the first time, they're like, wow. But, you get to them after, 20, 30 years, and like, oh, yeah. The woman came, she anointed Jesus' feet, she mopped it up with her hair. Nice. But I want us to pause for a moment. And I want you to, if you want to, you can close your eyes, but I want you to imagine that you are in the room. Somehow you've got an invite to this amazing banquet because something amazing has happened and someone's throwing a party and you've got invited. You're in the room. And as you're sitting there and you're hearing the stories about Lazarus being raised or whatever it was that was taking place, you're hearing these stories, and then as you're there, and there's lots of laughter and fun and good food and all sorts of things happening, lots of drinks flowing around. The room is in good spirits. And then you notice someone enter the room, someone you know, and she's carrying something. And then you recognize what she's carrying. It's like, oh, that's something she's been keeping for a very long time. And then she approaches the guest of honor. She gets down on her knees. And she cracks open what she has and she starts just pouring it over the feet of Jesus. And the room is filled with this fragrance. The whole house is filled. It feels a little overwhelming. And then you notice that this woman starts to uncover her head. And she undoes her hair. And as she does that, she leans down towards the feet of Jesus. And she takes her hair and she starts wrapping it around the feet of Jesus. From where you're sitting, you can't quite see very well, so you lean over to kind of goes, what's happening? And then you notice how close she is to the feet of Jesus. How do you feel as you witness that? What are some of the emotions that kind of get a little bit stirred up for you? For me, I was sort of thinking, I did this sort of process for myself through the week, and I'm thinking, I'd be feeling a little bit awkward. Like, ooh, this isn't normal. I don't think I've ever seen anyone get their head that close to someone else's feet intentionally. But there's this deep devotion being expressed. And it's kind of like, not in a crude or crass way, but it's kind of like this should be a private moment, not a public moment. And yet here is this, what's the phrase? A PDA, public display of affection. Very public. Very intimate, and the room witnesses it. And so there's something really significant that's happening here as Mary does this. Her wild, extravagant act of devotion towards Jesus. A place where she is completely humble before him. She's received something back that was so precious to her brother, and she wants to express her thanks towards Jesus. And so she takes the most expensive thing she has to do that. So this was not a normal kind of everyday event that happened in Jewish homes, from what I could gather. It's not like that every other week someone was mopping someone's feet with their hair. This was quite an outrageous act towards Jesus. And as we think about Mary, and we think about, her unbridled devotion, the fact that, to take out her hair in public was actually an act of humiliation, because she just didn't do that. As a woman in a Jewish society, you never just took out your hair. That was not what was done. It was an inappropriate act. And yet in the presence of Jesus, it seemed like the most appropriate thing to do. And as I looked at that encounter of what was happening there with Jesus and Mary around the table, and then I thought about Mary and just how she entered into that moment, not even thinking about anyone else in the room. For her, there was just her and Jesus. But then there are other people in the room, aren't there? And someone else speaks up. This extravagant gift that was given, that's been wasted, because, you can only use perfume once, right? Once you use it, it's gone. It's gone. And Judas says, well, we could have sold that. We could have done so much good with that money. And then there's a little side note underneath, a little more clarity around Judas's character, right? So he's not really worried about the poor. He's more worried about himself. But I started to think about the difference between Mary's act of devotion and Judas's statement. Because on the surface, right, Judas' statement is quite rational, right? And there'd be others in the room going, I think Judas has got a point. We could have done so much. All those people in the street who don't have food, we could have sold this. If she was happy just to pour it out on the ground, we could have done something far more with it. It's a very rational statement. But Jesus defends it, doesn't he? He says, but this is what needs to be done now in this moment. And he kind of makes a statement, goes, you'll always have the poor with you, but I'm only here for a moment. And we need to be careful that we don't interpret that as that, well, the poor can take care of themselves, because we know that the early church, as it came into being, was one where those with the least became the centre of the community. The church didn't do ministry to the poor, the church was the poor. But we read in the scripture in the early church that everyone came together, they sold all their possessions, and no one had want. So there was a definite heartbeat in the early faith community, and even today, that the message of Jesus is actually about how do we help lift everyone up so that we don't have people in poverty. So it's not an excuse statement. We're going to go, well, Jesus said the poor will always be around, so let's not worry about it. That's not what Jesus is saying at all. But as I looked at those two statements, or not the two statements, as I looked at the two people, as I looked at Mary and as she came, and as I looked at Judas, I saw one who came with an absolute clear passion for Christ, who placed herself at the very feet of Jesus, who was so physically close to Christ that she could take her hair and dry his feet. That's pretty close, isn't it? Drawn in to Jesus. And then there's Judas, who's kind of, he's more than arm's length away, I suspect. And he's making these statements that on the surface seem good. That on the surface seem like an okay statement, but they're a safe statement. It's not about how much does he press into Jesus. It's more like, well, let's step back and just have a bit of a think about this before we go too far. It's very rational. It's very clear. It's very safe. Mary came and she wasn't safe. She came and she acted inappropriately. particularly towards a man. And yet Jesus received it with a heart that was intended, a heart that was grateful, a heart that was open to the things of God. And we also need to remember that Lazarus and Mary and Martha, they had a pre-existing relationship with Jesus. They were friends before Lazarus died. And so when Lazarus died, Mary and Martha felt that they could go to Jesus. Actually, they sent the message to Jesus before he died. They said, Lazarus is really sick. It'd be great if he could come. Because they knew that Jesus could do something. So there was a pre-existing relationship. It's not just this moment. But there's this idea that as we see in this, that sometimes I think it's easier to keep Jesus at arm's length. That we can do the good, make the good statements, do the things that appear to be on the surface, like Lazarus' statement, like fair, rational response to what's happening. Our vision statement says that, we want to be an authentic community, that passionately follows Christ. Passionately follows Christ. And I don't know what that means for you, to be a passionate follower of Jesus. But I've seen people who are passionate about things in their world, and they aren't really that concerned about the people around them. You go to a footy game and you've got men who, hardly say boo during the week. They're very reserved in what they do. And then all of a sudden, roar for their team. They don't care about the people around them. And yet often my observation around the Christian community is that we're safe and rational. We don't want to be seen as the fanatical group who are totally sold out for Jesus. We've kind of got enough to keep us okay. Are we willing to be like Mary? Where there might be times when we are humiliated for the sake of our relationship with Jesus, that we are so drawn into wanting to be in his presence. And I know that our personalities and our lives and things like that influence how we live and how we express our emotions around us. So I don't want to get really prescriptive. But I do wonder if sometimes we sit more on the safe side rather than the willingness to humble ourselves before God, to get so close to Jesus. So close. And we think of Mary as physically close. But what about us in our walk with Christ? Do we draw close? Is he invited into every aspect? Is our love for God something that causes us to not worry about what others might think? That we would only be concerned about what Jesus thinks? That we might be willing to break the social norms to be able to kind of go, I'm a follower of Jesus. And because I follow Jesus, because of what Jesus has done for me, then I'm all in for him. And we can look at Mary and kind of go, well, this is a moment. She's received her brother back. It's a phenomenal event that they've witnessed. But if we think only a week later, Jesus' life, he gives it up for the sake of humanity. It is the unconditional love of God expressed through the sacrifice of the cross, but then through the power of the resurrection. And so I want to just encourage you as we sit with this idea of being passionate followers of Christ, where we see examples of radical devotion, the radical love of God that transforms us. Are we willing to go that extra bit more for the sake of God? I want to invite the team up. And we're going to conclude. We're going to a song to wrap up. And I guess I just want you to think about that challenge. You know, do you sit in a safe place in your relationship with God? That's the question. Are we in the safe zone where we just do enough good, where we've just got enough Jesus to make us feel okay? Or do we sit more in the extravagant sense of wanting to press into our relationship with God? You know, I could make some statements about what I observe here on a Sunday. You know, when we come in and the front 4 rows are empty generally, you know, that kind of, if I'm going to a footy game, I want to get close, right? You want to get close to the action. It seems here on a Sunday we want to get as far away from the action as we can, because you never know what might happen. What would it look like if we all started filling the rows from the front back? I guess everyone would just turn up later and later, right? And I'm not trying to pass judgment at all. I'm just sharing an observation, a lighthearted way to say, how do we measure our passion and our engagement with God? We could look at our Sundays and go, what does it look like then? But then that's only a very small window compared to what we do Monday to Saturday. What are the other ways in which we express our passion and devotion towards Jesus? In which we want to be so close to Jesus that we're really not that concerned about others around us. Because he is the one that matters. And as we draw close to Christ, he opens our eyes to see the world in a way that transforms us. So we're going to sing a song together, and I guess I just want to encourage you to ponder that. And if you feel like the Spirit of God nudging you in a particular way, respond to that. What is the one thing that you're noticing the Spirit of God encouraging you towards? Thanks.